Guys, today we're going to be looking at something called speciation, a process by which species emerged. So we'll go ahead and get you started here. So speciation. I believe last time we looked at evidence of evolution. So today we're looking at this process by which new species emerge and come on the scene. So we'll look at a couple of different examples here. The first thing we want to do is just go ahead and define what a species is. So let's go ahead and put this on here, a species. It's going to be a population whose members can interbreed and produce living offspring. We call that viable, and also fertile offspring that can themselves then reproduce. So that's the definition for a species. And really, for speciation to occur, you need something called reproductive isolation. So speciation goes kind of hand in hand with this reproductive isolation. So we'll look at a couple of different examples of some speciation. There's really two varieties here. And the first variety, they have some weird names, but the first variety is called Allo speciation, and this is other area or other, sometimes they say country, but I don't like using that term because it's technically not another country, it's just another area. So the speciation happened in another area. So we've got some geographic barrier or physical barrier happening here. So let's look at an example of speciation, allopatric speciation. So here's an example of allopatric speciation. You have this antelope squirrel in Arizona, and you also have this chipmunk that's in Arizona. Now, at one point in time, when the squirrels were able to navigate the gap, the canyon, and get back and forth between the south rim and the north rim, we probably had just one species. But now that canyon is so vast and the access is so limited for these squirrels and chipmunks to travel back and forth that they're now known as two separate species. They have the same genus, but different species. We can see that reflected in their name here. And now, if you were to bring a south rim squirrel over to the north, they won't breed with that squirrel that's over there. So this geographic barrier has essentially allowed these two groups to become reproductively isolated from one another and thus emerge as two different species, even though they're only separated by just a short distance, the gap of the canyon. That would be allopatric speciation. The other type of speciation is what we call sympatric. So go ahead and put that down here. So sympatric, sympatric. And this would be then same area. So speciation occurs, but it's in the same area. So we have the same physical area, but we have some other mechanisms are doing the isolating. It's not just geography in this case, it's some other mechanism. So let's get an example of that going here. So here we have the apple maggot fly and the hawthorn fly. And this is speciation due to host specialization. So apples aren't native to Americas, they're actually native to Europe. And prior to their introduction of apples into the Americas, the hawthorn is a tree that produces fruits that look like this. So these are hawthorns, and these flies are going to emerge from a hawthorn. They're going to lay their eggs, and then that egg will be fertilized, and then it'll hatch. The larvae will burrow into the fruit and use that fruit as an energy source as it matures into a fly. When it emerges as a fly as an adult, it'll lay its eggs, and then the whole process starts over again. So typically, what we see happening is because these fruits mature at different points in time, these flies have adapted to mimic or mirror that maturation with when they lay their eggs. So there's a relationship there between fruit maturity and then the egg laying and the maturation of the flies. And basically the flies that are using the hawthorns will continue to use the hawthorns because that puts them on a cycle that lines with those hawthorn fruits. And those that use apples will continue to use apples because, again, the timing is as such that they need the fruit maturation to kind of line up when the eggs get laid and go through that process. And we can see that right here in this figure, that we have this apple race of flies, that the percent of adult flies emerging are right here, right before the apples mature. So right like around, I don't know, 10 days before the apples mature. And then the hawthorns will emerge, adults will emerge right before the hawthorns mature. So they're, again, laying eggs right before the maturation of the fruit. And the fruit is offset by, like, let's say this is August, I don't know, 25th, and this is October 15th. So they're offset by maybe 30 days. So that difference in that timing affects which fly breeds on which fruit. And that's a type of sympatric speciation. We'll go ahead and make a note of that example here, that we have these apple maggot flies. And the hawthorn fly. And it's the maturation of these fruits and the seasonality. So we'll say fruit maturity is what dictates kind of which flies breed on which fruit. And now you just don't get much crossover between the species because their cycles have been set to that fruit maturity and seasonality. So finally, we're going to look at some different types of evolution. We're going to draw three different figures here. We're going to look at divergent evolution, and we'll go ahead and sketch that out. So here we've got time on our y-axis. So we have time over here, and then we're going to have kind of species differences down here. And the greater the distance between 2 points, the greater the differences in the species. So let's say that we have, let's say we're talking finches. Let's say we're talking Darwinian finches from the Galapagos, and we have one ancestral species. And then as time goes on, we have this branches off. And now we have two different groups that are distinct from one another. And then let's say time goes on further, and then we have kind of a fourth species, and then maybe even a fifth species. And then let's say that over here, we get a branching point, and we get a sixth species. So again, this is divergent evolution, where we have kind of a gradual change in allele frequencies. And if reproduction will not occur between 2 and 3 or 2 and 4 or 2 and 6, we know that they're different species. And again, an example of this are those Galapagos finches. And the structure here that we've made is called a cladogram. A cladogram, it's like a distance tree that shows us how related organisms are. And we can use biochemical information like nucleotide sequences, DNA, to somewhat figure out where these individuals would go on this cladogram if we had that evidence. So here's that divergent evolution. It can lead to what we call adaptive radiation, where we have one ancestral species of ground finch leading to the emergence of all of these finches that fill all these other niches and roles if they're reproductively isolated enough due to allopatric or sympatric mechanics. So we'll say what can result here is, we'll say adaptive radiation can occur. Over here to the right, we're going to look at kind of convergent. So we'll say convergent evolution. So let's go ahead and sketch this out. So we're going to have a similar setup. Where we'll have time, again, over here on the y-axis. And again, we'll have species differences over here. And with convergent evolution, we'll have, let's say, species A, that as time goes on, becomes more similar to species B, or species 1 and species 2. Now, they're not becoming the same species unless they were able to hybridize and produce viable fertile offspring, but they become more and more and more similar. Now, what causes this? So here we're looking at some New World animals on the left, the placental mammals, and then we have some Old World Australian marsupials. So again, these things are quite different. In fact, again, placental versus marsupial in terms of how they rear their young and carry their young. But it's selective pressures in the environment that shape these organisms to be more similar, even though they don't share recent common ancestry. So again, the wolf, North American gray wolf, the Tasmanian wolf, the ocelot that you find in South America, Tasmanian tiger cat, the flying squirrel, the flying phalanger, lemur, spotted cuscus, mouse, marsupial mouse, the lesser anteater, the numbat, mole, and marsupial mole. Again, not a close ancestry here, but similar selective pressures are shaping these animals to be and appear more similar. Again, they would need to hybridize to become one species, so that's very unlikely. So what we'll do here is we'll say that North American versus Australian species, and that's due to selective pressures rather than shared ancestry. Finally, we're going to look at something called co-evolution. And we'll sketch this out in a very similar way. So again, we have time over here. We essentially have species differences down here. And we'll say that here we have so we're not really accumulating species differences, but we are getting adaptations based on what one another accumulate over time. So let's get a look at it. So here we have a type of bird that's probably a nectar-eating bird with this long bill. And then we have this flower that has a perfect curvature that matches this nectar-feeding bill. Now, it's likely that either there's not very many pollinators or this is an extremely effective pollinator. So this plant is looking to attract this pollinator specifically with hiding nectar deep within this appendage here. And then this bird, this must be really high sugar concentrated nectar, that this bird is going to look specifically for this type of flower. It must provide some selective advantage where this relationship is going to benefit both parties, where this flower is wanting this specific pollinator, and this pollinator, or this bird in this case, is looking to get that nectar as its main sugar source, to have a bill that's so co-evolved to that. So this would be an example of coevolution. So again, what we'll say here is, we'll just kind of give this example that we can keep in mind. So this is this bird, and that flower, and the bird has this curved beak specifically for that type of flower. And there's other examples. That's just one that's kind of easy to see because of the physical features. Okay, so that is speciation. I hope that's helpful. I'll see you next time.